Hillsborough Law Now is a campaign group of, we're all volunteers. We are not run on bags of cash, and everything we do is just because we want to change the law. As I say, I'm Debbie Kane. So what I'm going to start doing is, Charlotte, I'm going to bring you in after I've said my bit, because I know that you're in work and I don't want any babies being delivered while you're here.
No problem.
Is that okay? Okay, so thanks for inviting us again. And I just want to start by just going through a few incidents from the past. So we've got All Greaves, Shrewsbury, contaminated blood, Stephen Lawrence, Stephen Port murders and the homophobia of Dagenham Police, Daniel Morgan, sisters Bieber Henry and Nicole Smallman. Photos of them were when they were deceased by the Met Police. Ian Tomlinson, John Charles de Mendes, Grenfell, Manchester Arena bombing, nuclear testing veterans, Sarah Everard, Rochdale child abuse, countless custodies and detention, undercover police and inquiry, the Iraq War, forced adoption, DWP death by suicide after claims had stopped, child migrants, Birmingham bombing just number 21, truth about Zane, Horizon post office scandal, Partygate, Primados pregnancy testing scandal, thalidomide, Alder Hay organ scandal, Barry Murphy massacre, the Catholic Church's sexual abuse, the Church of England sexual abuse, Bloody Sunday, Rotherham child abuse, Jimmy Savile, Northern Ireland troubles, COVID-19 family bereaved, NHS maternity scandals, mental health scandal, care home scandal, Robbie Powell, Lucy Letby, and countless maternity scandals, Hillsborough. Many injustices, but different circumstances, but a common thread that goes through all these campaigns of the last half century and beyond. It's how the state protects itself and it knows it's culpable. Every family who've lost a loved one in any of these scandals know how it goes. Ministerial denials, missing paperwork, untruths, victim blaming. They know how hard it is to get the state to tell the truth in the first time being asked. The culture of the state, from the police and the public servants to the NHS, is deny, object, cover up, smear and lie. Whistleblowers are demoted and pushed out of their jobs for telling the truth and withholding evidence, and are encouraged to lie, detract and denounce the truth. Witnesses intimidated, gaslit, fear of losing their jobs, or ridiculed, demoralised and bullied to get with the programme of covering up. We need a law that shields witnesses, gives them the confidence to do the right thing and protects them to want when they do so, and empowers them to tell the truth without fear of retribution. People should feel able to say to managers and colleagues, no, it's a criminal offence to cover up and lie, and we must level the justice in this country, so we need a Hillsborough Law Now. Hillsborough Law Now, what is it? So in 2017, then Prime Minister, the Right Honourable Theresa May, asked the then Reverend Bishop of Liverpool, James Jones, to undertake a review into the lessons learned from Hillsborough, the patronising disposition of unaccountable power. Published in November 2017, 6 years ago, with the recommendations that one was, sorry, I've lost my way. Recommendations of the review still not being acted on, and no legislation have been forthcoming. The review detailed 25 recommendations which form the basis of the proposed Hillsborough Law. It would give bereaved families better access to legal aid, legal representation at inquest, and create a level playing field. Legal cost of survivors or representatives of deceased have access to justice. Most of our campaigns have had to fundraise for legal support and rely on pro bono work to fight the state, and our lawyers up in the best firms money can buy. Money is no object. We want to put in place a statutory duty of candour for all public servants and public officials. Currently, the police have a duty to cooperate during court proceedings, inquiries and investigations, and failure to cooperate in this duty is deemed as an internal misconduct matter and leaves the police to investigate or initiate disciplinary proceedings in the hands of the police themselves. So basically, they're the ones who tell themselves off. A new legal duty of candour on public authorities to tell the truth and proactively cooperate with officials' investigations and inquiries. Failure to comply would be a criminal offence. So what happens now is when the police are asked a question, for whatever reason it is, first thing they say is no comment. They're told to say that straight away. But before I go any further, I'd like to bring in Charlotte, who will tell us her story and about her lovely dad and what he went through and why we need a Hillsborough Law Now. So, Charlotte, it's you.
Hi, everyone. You'll have to excuse what I'm wearing. Sorry, my ward manager's very kindly given me a little bit of an extra break for me to be able to do this because she knows how important it is to me. So my name's Charlotte Hennessy and I'm the daughter of Jimmy Hennessy, who was killed at Hillsborough. My dad was 29 and I was 6. So I was very young at that time, whereas now I'm a 41-year-old mother of 4 sons. And it's only been within recent years that I've fully got to know what exactly happened to my dad. So just as a little bit of a trigger warning, some of what I'm going to say is going to be upsetting. It is going to be triggering. I won't be offended if you mute me or if you don't want to listen. That's fine because it is a hard listen, but it's the truth and it's my dad's truth. And if Hillsborough Law is going to be a legacy to the 97 who were killed at Hillsborough, then we need to hear the harsh reality of what those people went through on the day. So my dad always went to matches, home and away. That was my norm. If I had a party on a Saturday, I could go to the party providing my mum would take me. Because if there was a match on and my dad was going to that and I had no hope of him coming with me. So it was never unusual for my dad to go to games, whether that was abroad, away, at Anfield, wherever Liverpool, where my dad was. He travelled to the game with his best friend, Brian Bickerstaff, and James Delaney, who also passed away, was on their coach. It was a local coach. My dad actually nearly missed the coach, but he ran after it and they stopped for him. So he had alcohol levels equivalent of the levels that we have now, less to drive. So he would have been fine to drive a car, get in a vehicle. He wasn't drunk. He had a ticket. He went through the turnstiles. He was where he was supposed to be. He went straight down the tunnel behind the goal where he always went to watch the match. In CCTV footage, you can see that my dad starts right at the top, sort of in the back of pen 3, closer to pen 2. And by less than 5 minutes later, he's right down the front, more over to pen 4, right by the fences. I never learned how my dad got out of the pen. We think he's probably climbed over because he was quite fit, quite healthy. He was found by a police officer behind the goal. And it wasn't until the HIP report was released in 2012 that I learned all of these things. So my dad had been dead for 23 years and I was only just now finding out what had happened to him. So my dad was sitting up, he was lifting his arm, he was signalling for help. A police officer come over to help him. For whatever reason, upon his observation, he felt that my dad then stopped breathing, maybe became unconscious. So he started CPR, at which point my dad vomited. And then he continued to give CPR. He says that he was assisted by a St John ambulance person who also did CPR, but I never ever found him. But firemen took my dad with the police officer on a stretcher to the gym where they believed that he would get further medical assistance. And he was very much so alive at that stage. My dad had opened his eyes. So they took him into the gym, put him in the far right corner of the gym. and that's where he was left, and he was just left. So 2 other police officers then come along with a view of searching the body for some form of identity, and they put my dad unconscious in a body bag where he continued to vomit and continued to struggle to breathe. So then they come back along, they unzip the body bag, they note that he's vomited inside and that he's very hot and very sweaty. They search him, they clean him down, they put him back in the body bag. And my dad's cause of death was inhalation of copious amounts of stomach content caused by the crush asphyxia. And I think that's probably one of the most shocking parts of Hillsborough, is that for many years, people were told they were unsavable. They were all dead by 3:15. They all died the same way. They didn't. And my dad was very much so alive. I think his last sighting of being alive was at 9:04. So you that told on an original death certificate that your loved ones died of traumatic asphyxiation and was dead by 3:15, to then find out that actually they were very much so alive, and the only reason why they died is because he was ultimately put in a body bag alive. So when the new inquests started, I was probably quite naive. It was a lot to take in. It was very overwhelming. I was, even though it's been my life, these Hillsborough family members, you don't fully associate yourself with them. The people that I've seen on the TV that have, you've watched and you've thought, they're doing that. And my dad was one of them as well. But now I'll always be forever grateful for all Hillsborough family members and survivors who fought when I was too little to. Because if they hadn't, I never would have found out what happened to my dad, and we probably would never have known that he was alive for so long if it wasn't for all those who campaigned for Hillsborough, because there was no law to protect people like me and people like those who died at Hillsborough. So going forwards there's been no private prosecutions because Duckenfield was ultimately found not guilty. But there needs to be a positive that comes out of this, and that has got to be that we change the law. We also cannot settle for anything less than anyone within a public sector, because we've had, in my dad's case, we've not only just had police officers that lied, we've had St John ambulance volunteer who has refused to come forward. We've had police officers that have then refused to give evidence at the inquest because they said that their mental health was too severe, with no consideration for my mental health. I'm diagnosed with post-traumatic stress, but I still had to go to those inquests every day. And also the coroner, the pathologist, they all lied. They all collectively told a lie. But aside from that side of life, I work in healthcare, in maternity myself, and we all have a duty to tell the truth. We all have a duty to protect those that are more vulnerable than we are. And I just think, we can't rely on the police, to be honest, because they're not. So, if any changes are going to come from anything that any of us went through at Hillsborough, it needs to be a change in the law. What are you going to say, Deb?
I was just going to say then about when you asked, when the police officers who were asked to talk about your dad, and you said, and you've mentioned it then about that they didn't feel willing and able to go to the inquest for their mental health. And then I heard a story about the same sort of situation where, and I think that was Anne Williams's, it might have been Anne, or it might have been Margaret's son, when the pathologist got on the phone to the copper and said, "Oh, you're wrong, you need to change your statement."
Yeah. It was, so I think maybe Anne Williams, Kevin Williams. So the current, so it was during the inquest, the original inquest. The police officer was giving evidence saying that that Kevin had spoken to her and he had said mum. And the coroner told her in a courtroom full of people that she was wrong, but she knew what she'd seen. She knew she'd cradled Kevin, and she knew that he'd said mum. He spoke. He was very much so alive. And then he passed away in her arms. And the coroner told her in an open courtroom that that couldn't possibly have happened. You know, how did he know? He wasn't there.
Yeah. And then the other one I heard was when a copper went to, a copper had put a statement in, and I think it was about Anne's son. No, I think it was Margaret's son. And the chief constable went to his house and sat there for 8 hours.
And made him
change a statement, and got to the point where he made the pathologist go on the phone to the police constable to say, you are lying, this is not true, you are making up, change your statement. And that was days, weeks after the actual offence. So they were openly going around, and it wasn't just the police, it was the police, it was the fire, and it was also the coroners, and it was the ambulance, not the fire, the ambulance service, and they were all under the same mantra of change your statement, it's a lie.
Yeah.
And no one's ever been done for that, ever.
And I think as well, you know, you hear a lot of people say, oh, well, that was the culture then. It's still the culture now. Nothing's changed.
And we'll hear about that from the campaigners who are on the call now. Thanks, Charlotte. You always get...
I'm sorry to be rude, but I'm going to go. Sorry.
All right.
See you all soon.
See you soon. So, just before we go on, hiya Kai, before we go on, just on a show of hands, if you just do a reaction or a show of hands, did you know what Hillsborough Law was before we told you, or is it something that everyone seems to know? Because what I'm trying to figure out is, if a lot of people outside of Liverpool think it's about safety in the football pitch, or it's just about Hillsborough, does everybody know what Hillsborough Law is? Can anyone give us any show of hands? So that's what? 3, 1, 2. I expect you to know, Kai. Wow. Okay. So that's quite telling, isn't it? So Hillsborough Law's it's not about Hillsborough. Hillsborough is one of our many campaigns that come under the Hillsborough Law campaign, and it's about large and it's also about small individual campaigns. So there's a couple of us on this call now. I'm going to go to Kai next. Kai's going to talk about the truth about Zane, and then we'll have Will, and then we'll have Tony. So Kai, can I hand this over to you? You're on mute. So there you go.
You can all hear me okay, and I'll be brief. People can ask questions. Very much like many of the justice campaigns, Truth About Zane is a state cover-up, and once the truth comes out through means of quasi-judicial things like independent panel inquiries, then it should become a criminal matter as to what happened. My son, who you can see here, was 7 years old. This is little Zane, and Zane was in our home during the first floods attributed to climate change in the UK. Unknown to us, the flood water had passed through some land that was secret landfill, and it had absorbed the material that was in that land and brought it underneath our home, which is a Victorian house, with a flood basement, a soil flood basement. And from that flood basement, it released hydrogen cyanide, the mass weapon of mass destruction, the chemical weapon of mass destruction that was used in concentration camps to kill millions during World War II. And it's invisible, it's odorless, it's in the house. We don't know anything about it. We're busy defending the house from the floods. because the flood basement, so long as you pump the water out quicker than it rises, all habitable areas are dry, and the house is all electric. So our pumps were all electric. I knew nothing about it. My wife managed to raise the alarm, and she was resuscitating Zain, our 7-year-old child, who she found collapsed. And she alerted the emergency services. We were all taken to hospital. The fire brigade and specialist hazmat entered the house. They detected the hydrogen cyanide at very high levels. That report went to area meetings, silver meetings, gold meetings, which escalate to emergency COBRA. Port and Down were called in as soon as hydrogen cyanide was detected. So Port and Down were in at 8:23 in the morning on the 8th of February 2014, and by 5 o'clock there was an emergency COBRA meeting. After the emergency COBRA meeting had only received information on hydrogen cyanide, a government spokesperson from Number 10 announced that the little boy in Chertsey had died from carbon monoxide poisoning, from exhaust fumes from petrol pumps used by the parents to clear floodwater. And that misdirection was utilised to disrupt the community, disempower the community, and therefore they became completely dysfunctional in believing the story that it was carbon monoxide killed Zain. At the same time, that obviously demonised us, so we weren't going to get any support from any quarter, and that's usually the idea behind a false narrative. In the meantime, the whole area had to be evacuated. There were actually many unwell people, we now know, from Freedom of Information requests, and those many unwell people overwhelmed the local hospital. Many people needed to be decontaminated. That was reported in the press. The area was evacuated for 4 weeks. We could not move back into our home for a further year. Over the course of time, with lots of information being clearly ushered away from us, as happens in these sorts of things, so long as you don't know the truth, and the people that do know the truth are not telling it, just as you saw with Partygate, we have experienced that from 2014, day in, day out, people just denying everything that was true. And then that goes into the arena of coroner's court. And at the coroner's court, we were denied any legal aid for representation, not once, not twice, but 3 times in a sham inquest. We were up against 6 local authorities. Every single one of them had legal aid for years coming from the public purse. They employed the very best legal counsel, and at that time Queen's Counsel. And when I say the very best, they were award winning. They were the gold award, silver award, platinum award winning in their areas. They had the very best. So there was no duty of candour. There was no public advocacy to support us. We had no parity of arms, and people were able to walk around telling lies as they chose to. My father said to me, "Why do you go to this inquest when you know that everything's a total lie?" And I said, "Dad, well, I've got to at least see what's going on, because that will place me in a position to be able to determine what happens going forward." As we went forward, we amassed support from all over the place. 118,000 people have signed Zain's petition. Zain is in the Labour Party manifesto as one of the burning injustices of our time against a child. And we found out throughout all of this that the local authority knew all along, because they knew it was landfill. They didn't tell anyone else. And in fact, they built a property 10 yards from where Zain was killed, and they built it with a gas-proof membrane because their reports said there is migrating landfill gases, the risk is high, the consequences are injury and death. So 4 years before Zane was killed, they built their property based on the reports that they had about the death that was going to happen. They protected themselves, which is clear. Zane's death, they had forewarning. It was entirely preventable. So that gives you an idea of the support that we have, why we support the Hillsborough Law Now. We've been very close to Andy Burnham, supporting from the initiation. We participated with the Bishop James Jones in his report, and hereafter we need to make sure that these sorts of injustices don't happen to others. And so we are very clear that there are many injustices, but one struggle. Thank you.
Thanks, Kai. Always eloquent. So that goes on to the next person I'd like to introduce is Steve Pearce from the Toxic Veterans. I always get it wrong, don't I? Lab Rats.
Yep.
Steve knows exactly what we want to hear from him. So I'll pass it on to you.
Hi, my name's Steve Pearce, and I represent Lab Rats, which is a welfare and support group that looks after the nuclear test veterans. Now, the nuclear test veteran story is not one that is commonly known. It's not something that's taught in schools. Not many people know about how Britain got hold of their own atomic weapons. There's a feeling that we just borrowed them off the Americans. Well, that's not true, because between 1952 and 1991, 22,000 British service personnel served on the British nuclear weapons testing programme. My father was one of them. Most of these men had no choice but to go. They were often national servicemen. They were posted there. They weren't even told what was going on. They just said, you've got to go to Christmas Island, you've got to go to Marylington in South Australia. And they thought, great, sounds nice and warm, that'll be great. And then when they get there, they said, well, you've got to watch these atomic weapons being detonated. And they did. They had no choice. Now, the government's line is that they weren't placed in any harm. You know, it's safe, isn't it, a nuclear weapon? You can sit 8 miles away from a detonation and be fine, which we all know is ludicrous. So what protection were they given? Well, most of them were given a pair of sunglasses, and that was it. So they had their shorts and their shirts, sometimes even no top, and they were 8 miles from the centre of a nuclear weapon. Now, if they're a safe government claim, why are they a weapon? It beggars belief. And then apparently the men came home and they were all fine and healthy. But of course, we know that's probably not the truth. Most of those 22,000 service personnel are now dead. There's about 1,700 left. Most, 99% of those still have major health concerns. Many have cancers. Many have other serious conditions that can be associated with radiation damage. Most of the men who sadly aren't with us have died from cancers and leukemias and all sorts of conditions also associated with radiological poisoning. But it doesn't just stop at the veterans, because as we know, radiation damages DNA, and that can be passed on through the generations. And this is kind of where my story kicks in, because my dad served at Marylington in South Australia, and he was there between 1962 and 1963. Prior to him being there, there had been 7 nuclear weapons detonated on the land that he lived and worked on. And they were close, because Dad said there was nothing to stop him walking up to ground zero. And he did, and he saw the glass bowl where the sand had been turned to glass at the centre of the explosion. And then after the 7 nuclear weapons test has been done, they conducted what's called the minor trials, which are anything but minor trials. These were some of the most toxic experiments ever conducted on this planet. They were trying to simulate, this is an example of what they were trying to do, they were trying to simulate what would happen if an aircraft carrying a nuclear weapon were to crash, as Dad put it, what would it take to make that weapon pop? So they would do things like take plutonium and warheads and all this kind of stuff and literally pile TNT on top of it and just blow it sky high. They were looking at dispersal of the radiation, dispersal of the plutonium itself, and all that kind of stuff. And Dad reports seeing jets of molten plutonium spraying 200 foot in the air, and that's got to come down somewhere. And of course it comes down in the desert, in the sand that's all around them. So there were 593 of those tests. My dad was there at the end. So that land is probably, at the time, one of the most toxic places on this planet. And yet there was a whole airfield and all that kind of stuff. There were people living there amongst it. And then when we go back to thinking about safety precautions, well, Dad said it was laughable because they would have the contaminated area and the non-contaminated area that was separated by a single strand wire fence, which is ludicrous because it's a desert. There's a permanent wind there and the sand is so fine it blows. And this contaminated sand, Dad said, was in your hair, it was in your clothes, it was in your Land Rover, it was in your bed, it was everywhere. He said we were living covered in radioactive sand. But of course at the time they didn't realise that because they believed the lie that everything was safe and no one was exposed. The government have said that no one was exposed and then later changed their mind. It is a national disgrace. It's one that Andy Burnham himself said has been a criminal cover-up on an industrial scale, because we have documents that say, these going back to the 50s from Whitehall, that say that that the government wanted to know the effects of nuclear weapons on equipment and personnel, both protected and unprotected. So they were using these men as guinea pigs. They were just collateral. And that's awful. Because as I say, my dad was there, and then when he came home, I was born 10 years later. And I have visible differences. I was born disabled, not just one condition, with quite a few. And Dad always blamed himself for that, although he never said as much. He said it once when I was born, and then was silent ever after about his feelings towards whether I was affected by it. But he looked at my mum when he was the one that broke the news about my disability to my mum, and he said, "There's a problem with Stephen." He said he's disabled, and it's all my fault because of my service in Australia. And he never said anything more. And that in itself, as a family, an unspoken thing in the family, put the stress on the whole family. And certainly, I think it stressed my dad out for the whole of his life. And as I said, it passed from my dad to me. And the next problem is, what about the generations to come? Because we've been told conservatively that there's going to be a 500-year genetic damage fallout through the generations. And sadly, recently, I've come to find out that my own son, he's two and a half, and a couple of weeks ago, we found out he has a rare genetic inherited condition. His teeth are crumbling, and teeth are one of the things that are reported as being damaged amongst the descendant cohort. And that's my own son. And that doesn't bear thinking about, because I now feel guilty that I brought him into this world. I played genetic Russian roulette with his life, and he has a condition. And us descendants rarely have just one condition. So I'm now really worried, waiting for the next thing. What's going to be next? Is it going to be a tumour? Is it going to be cancer? Am I looking at losing it? Because the infant mortality rate amongst the descendants is 5 times what you would have in the natural population. The miscarriage rate amongst the wives and the children of the nuclear descendants is 3 times that you would find in the national, in normal national figures. The birth defect rate is 10 times what you would find in the natural population. And yet the government say there's no evidence. Yet how can you ignore figures like that? So we want to try and get some evidence. We want to get our hands on the truth. Now, what would help will be access to our father's medical records. And at the moment, I can't get my dad's. No one can get the medical records out of the government. The MOD are sitting on them. They know where they are, because we know for a fact that every serviceman had to have blood taken before they went, blood taken at regular intervals while they were serving there, and blood taken when they got back, and urine samples. Now, we've got veterans that will testify that they've had them taken, and the vials that they're put in have a radiation symbol on them, which is telling in itself. So these records do exist. They're somewhere, because the government have gone from saying, we don't know where they are, we've lost them, they never existed, and now they say, we have them, but you can't have them. I have an email only a month ago saying that the government, that the MOD has done a search for the information I requested, and they found that information, but I am not allowed to have it. So without having Dad's medical records, I don't actually know what he was exposed to, what the damage in his blood was. And it's that it's knowing that will help us get an idea of perhaps what's affected me, what's affected my son. And it will also be the start for some meaningful research into the health of descendants, because we've got to protect future generations, because the government isn't going to do it. So we have to. So what we've had to do is sue the government for withholding those records. And as we all know, they ain't going to help us. So we're having to crowdfund to get this done. We are being quite successful. We've got enough backing and money now to take this forward, but it's not going to be an easy fight. And if we had a Hillsborough law, we wouldn't be asking men in their 80s and 90s and their families to pay to get their information out of the government. That's just wrong. If we had a Hillsborough law, we should be able to say, I want my dad's medical records, and they go, there you are. But it doesn't work like that. And also, what about legal representation? We're having to pay for that. And it's the same with the war pensions tribunals that the nuclear veterans had to go through. They're not qualifying for war pensions because it wasn't what they call active service. Yet it was dangerous. You can't get more dangerous than a nuclear weapon. So they were going up against banks of lawyers. The government have wasted millions of taxpayers' money fighting old men to get a few quid each month. And it's disgusting. It really is. So this is why we need the Hillsborough law. It's to support all these groups of people that we're hearing about today. And as has been said, it's not just the police. I mean, because my problem is with the MOD and the politicians. It's basically civil service as a whole, and every state employee has to be covered by this duty of candour. Because the minute you leave someone out, you leave scope for an injustice and suffering. So we need to get that done now. So I'd just like to thank everyone for listening. Thanks very much.
Always a pleasure, and every time gets me, every single time. Yeah, so at the moment we've got just a little bit of an update. On the 6th of December, the bishop is going to the government's going to respond to the bishop's report. Now, the thing that they're doing is they're packaging their own thoughts of what Hillsborough law is, and they're going to try and sell it to the public, and we all need to be ready to say it's not Hillsborough law. Our problem is not just with the police, our problem is with all public servants right across the board. And if any of it needs to be a complete blanket statutory duty of candour. There's no gaps, because I think we'll be coming on to say how the gaps from what you've been going through the last God knows how long. And also as well, one of the recommendations for Hillsborough law is obviously an equal playing field to legal aid, but also a cap. So at the moment, and I'm sure our COVID-19 families and contaminated blood families will be able to say, is when you go into a court, our families will have one barrister, and God knows, one barrister, one, if they're lucky, a clerk, and maybe a solicitor. They will have a barrister each, and so many solicitors and so many clerks. We need to even the playing fields there as well. We shouldn't be spending all this money on uneven scales of justice. It should be equal. And if they just gave us an equal playing field, it wouldn't cost any more, because what they're spending on their 10 barristers, there was 2 barristers. You're saving money, 1 each. You don't need to have all this. But what I'm going to do now, I'm going to go to Will next. Will's fight is older than Hillsborough, and he's been going through this on his own. So if you think like Hillsborough families have had it hard, but one thing is that they've all been able to say, Will's been going through this on his own, the same as Kai and Steve. I mean, Steve, you've had your group, haven't you? But individuals have got no one. So I'm going to go to Will next.
Hello all, and thank you for sharing the stories with us. Robbie actually died a year and 2 days after Hillsborough. He died of a treatable disease that was suspected 4 months before he died. The disease invariably results in death without treatment, and the test was ordered. Unfortunately, it was never done, and neither my wife or I were informed of the suspicion of Addison's disease or the need for the test. The general practitioners were informed that Robert could have Addison's, that he needed the test, and that he should be referred immediately back to hospital if he becomes unwell. Addison's disease is a condition that has vague symptoms, and it's very difficult to diagnose. Sorry, it's difficult to suspect because of that reason. But the ACTH test diagnoses the condition. Well, Robert fell ill again 4 months later, and he was seen by 5 general practitioners on 7 occasions in the last 15 days of his life. 1 GP read the medical records during that period. The child was seen by 3 GPs 4 times in the last 3 days of his life. On the last day, he was seen twice. He'd been unconscious, he'd had dilated pupils and central cyanosis. The GP refused hospital admission. We called her out the second time. She again refused hospital admission. She then agreed after a heated argument. I asked for an ambulance. She refused. I took Robbie to hospital. It took me approximately half an hour in my car. And on arrival, I watched him take his last conscious breath. He was declared dead shortly after that. He wasn't cold on his deathbed when the hospital doctors were lying to me. I saw Robert's records 3 days after his death and was devastated to learn that Addison's disease had been suspected and that the parents had been informed, which was untrue. Thereafter, there was a cover-up between the doctors and the GPs, beg your pardon, and the paediatricians. They falsified Robbie's records. They removed the information about Addison's disease. And I fought them for 33.5 years, trying to prove the gross negligence, which has been accepted, but also the lies and the cover-up. I first went to the coroner. He appointed a pathologist who works for the hospital to perform their post-mortem. She withheld the fact that Robert was suspected of Addison's. She withheld from the report that the ACTH test had been ordered, and had it been given, Robert would have been diagnosed and would have lived. She claimed he was well nourished, but in fact he died as a consequence of dehydration. It was 1/3 of his body weight had been lost. Through the complaints procedure and the coroner, beg your pardon, the coroner refused an inquest, and it took me 14 years to have an inquest. It was a 20-day inquest over 3 months. The verdict was neglect, natural causes caused by neglect. The complaints procedure failed me. I went to the Welsh office and appealed, cost me £34,000. During those proceedings, there was a conspiracy or collusion between the GPs and the Welsh Office officials. Their appeal collapsed. It took me 3 years to prove that they'd introduced Robert's records, which had gone missing. It was a complete shambles. It was devastation. I was even told, on top of the £34,000 I had to find, that I should actually, it's a gesture of goodwill that the doctors hadn't made an application for costs against me. After the Welsh Office, I went to the police. I was advised by the Director of Public Prosecutions at the time to go to Dyfed-Powys Police. What I didn't know was the GPs were retained as police surgeons for that very police force. Between 1994 and 2000, Dyfed-Powys Police covered up Robbie's death, as did the CPS who were advising them. I complained about the Chief Constable and the Deputy Chief Constable, and I eventually had a third independent criminal investigation between 2000 and 2002. 35 suggested charges were set out against 5 GPs and the secretary. However, the CPS ruled that because of the passage of time, which was actually caused by the cover-up involving the CPS and the police, they wouldn't be prosecuted. And also, the police of the CPS in 1996 had given these GPs, after a cover-up, a letter of immunity, which was relied upon by the CPS in 2003. I made complaints about Dyfed-Powys Police, and they were found institutionally incompetent. I made complaints about the CPS, they were covered up. In 2003, the then Director of Public Prosecutions told me he's shutting the case in my complaints, and that any further correspondence from me will be filed without response. A decade later, my former MP had a legitimate debate exposing the CPS, which resulted in the then Director of Public Prosecutions, Alison Saunders, calling for a full legal review of Robbie's case. That was in October of 2014. That's been ongoing now for 9 years. I'm not happy with the reports I've so far received, and I've challenged the content of them. But as I say, that is still ongoing. But back in 1996, when we tried to get the doctors into the civil courts, the GPs made an application claiming they did not have a legal duty to tell the truth. So therefore, my complaint for post-traumatic stress disorder, which was established by a psychiatrist, was thrown out of the High Court. We appealed. The appeal judges ruled the same, and it happened to be Lord Justice Stuart Smith was one of them, who you all know was involved in Hillsborough in this very same year, 1997. We asked for leave to appeal. It was refused. We petitioned the House of Lords, asking for leave. They refused. We took the case to the European Court of Human Rights. And this is the very important piece. Whilst it is arguable that doctors had a duty not to falsify medical records under the common law, St Donaldson, Master of the Rolls, duty of candour, before Powell v Bollards, there was no binding decision of the courts as to the existence of such a duty. As the law stands now, however, doctors have no duty to give parents of a child who died as a result of their negligence a truthful account of the circumstances of the death, nor even refrain from deliberately falsifying records. So it was confirmed for the first time, I think, in any court that these doctors did not owe a legal duty of candour, which meant I couldn't claim for the post-traumatic stress disorder that they had caused by the post-death cover-up. Hillsborough law is so important now, and it has to be an individual legal duty of candour. And I know this through experience. Because of my comparing and my wife's, and the fact we exposed the absence of a duty of candour, we actually had a law introduced in 2014 for organisations, very similar to what they're trying to do now. Not give it to the individual, give it to the head of police or the chief constable or whoever. That is not good enough. We need an individual duty of conduct for every public servant and official, which I believe should include MPs, which I don't think the majority want. But that's part of my story. I've summarised it best as I could. And thank you for the opportunity.
Oh, no, thanks, Will, and thanks for speaking. Amazing story. Well, shocking story. I mean, going back like a few years ago, if I'd have heard, before I understood what this was all about, like what Hillsborough Law was, if I'd have heard some of the stories, I'd have thought they're mad. It's a conspiracy theory. We're all wearing tin hats. And it's not until you actually look into it and you actually see it, and there's no other explanation for it, that there is a cover-up at every single level. It makes you completely question every single thing, doesn't it? But thanks for speaking. I'd like to invite Tony in now, because his story goes, I think, probably pre-Hillsborough as well, with the fatherless generation of the Haemophilia Society, the haemophilia families. So, Tony, I'll pass to you. You're on mute.
Is that better?
Yes.
Okay, so my name's Tony Farrugia, and the reason I'm here tonight to talk to you guys is my involvement in the contaminated blood scandal. My father was a mild haemophiliac. There are 3 variations or degrees of haemophilia: mild, moderate, and severe. And our family gene was a mild haemophilia. So my father was born into a family that consisted, at that time in the 70s and 80s, of the largest haemophilia family in East London, which consisted of 7 family members. Only one of those members is still alive today, but 5 of them were infected through contaminated blood products administered by the NHS in the 70s and 80s. My father was born and diagnosed as a mild haemophiliac when he was 6 months old. And up until the discovery of cryoprecipitate in around 1964 by Judith Paul, my father was treated with fresh frozen plasma for his bleeds. I have his medical notes from when he was born until the day he died. And from those medical notes, there was very little treatment as a child, being a mild haemophiliac. So he was never really given very many treatments. I think when I actually went through the medical notes, I think I was able to identify around 9 treatments as a child. So not very much treatment. 1977 changed all that, and my father had been working away in Wales, and he was a gas fitter. He was a mild haemophiliac, so he was able to have a very normal life. He also had 2 brothers who were haemophiliacs, and they were all employed in good jobs. In 1977, my father attended Heath Park Hospital in Cardiff after a minor injury or a minor fall on the beach. We were playing as children on holiday. His regular treatment was in London, but when he was away on holiday, he was fully aware that he could visit any haemophilia centre and he would be given treatment. And this is where he met Arthur Bloom. A lot has been found out since the inquiry started. I'm just trying to give you a brief idea of how it all started. So in 1977, my father was switched from a relatively safe product of cryoprecipitate, which was 1 donor, to an American pooled product, which was made up of tens of thousands of donors, and it only took one of those donors to carry a disease, and it would infect the entire batch. So he was infected with hepatitis B in 1977. I remember seeing him look like Homer Simpson. He was completely yellow, and this was only a few days after the treatment. We also now know that on that first infusion of factor VIII, and it was well known by the government and the medics, certainly the doctors, that the first infusion would expose you to hepatitis C, but hepatitis C was a slow burner. So he tested positive for hepatitis B in 1977. The virus kind of cleared on its own. He never cleared the virus, but it used to go through stages of where it would flare up and then die back down. And then in 1980, again, while on holiday in Wales, he had a minor accident, twisted his ankle, which caused a bleed, and was treated by Arthur Bloom. And then we've sort of jumped to 1984. My father's become very unwell. He's attended hospital. Things in the family home are starting to break down. I think there's a lot of stress. I didn't know that HIV was creeping into the haemophilia. The eye line. I know that my dad had seen a program on it, but as children we were not aware. The relationship in the family really got bad, and I was sent to live with a relative in Luton. Shortly after, I think around 5 months in the summer of 1985, that relationship broke down. And at the time, I didn't know that my father had been in contact with the family member and told them that he'd been identified as being HIV positive. I subsequently found out he was told in February 85. So summer of 85, I was then actually just picked up in the street by I was at a friend's house, and I was just walking down onto the roadway, and a car pulled up beside me, and 3 people got out. They identified themselves as social services, and I was taken into care. I subsequently learned, again recently, but at that time I knew nothing about the HIV. My father visited in November of 1985, a week after my 14th birthday, and that's when I was told by my father that he'd contracted HIV through the contaminated products that he was given by the NHS for his mild haemophilia. It was a few weeks after Rock Hudson had died, so at that time that was also in my eye line of this new, what we were told was the gay plague. So we didn't speak about it. The stigma was awful. I visited my father at Christmas 1985. I was in the care home, and then into 1986 my father's health deteriorated, and he was sectioned under the Mental Health Act in April of 1986. I am aware now, I couldn't remember, that I did see my father one more time. I believe it was in the June of 1985. He never came out of hospital again, and sadly he died in September of 1986 from the HIV virus. 3 weeks after my father's death, we then subsequently learned that my uncle had also been infected with HIV, and a few years later that my other uncle, when the test for hepatitis C became available, that he'd also been exposed to hepatitis C. I left the care home, I think, just before my 16th birthday, and I returned back to family, to the family member that I'd been sent to in Luton, and then subsequently just went through my life of work, marriage, children. But this was always in the back of my mind, and the family were obviously, because we had 2 other family members that were also infected. It was difficult. There was a big split in the family of the people that are infected and the people who are not. There was a lot of stigma. Both my dad and my uncle both experienced stigma where they were living. I was separated from my twin brother because I had brothers. I was separated from my twin brother, and on my dad's death, he was also placed into care 100 miles away. I didn't see my brothers again until 2010, when we were finally reunited, and it wasn't any animosity as to the reason why we didn't grow up together. It was purely for the fact that my father had been murdered, and the family dispersed to all four corners of the UK, really. I then decided in 2009, because I'd never spoken out, I'd never been public because of the HIV. I then, in 2009, after the Archer report, and the government's failure to implement Recommendation H, which was to compensate these families as per the Irish scheme that had been set up years earlier, that never happened. So I took it quietly to campaign, to attend Parliament, to speak to my MP, and then in 2014 I decided to go public, and I then acquired my father's medical notes. I did receive a full set of medical notes, but I have since found that there was a document missing that was listed in another report that I had from the HIV litigation. So documents have been removed from my father's medical notes. I have made all this aware to the public inquiry. All three family members, all three uncles have now died. I found out during the course of the inquiry that another uncle was infected and died in the 70s. And my cousin is still alive. So yeah, it's been a difficult road, and reading my father's medical notes and how he suffered daily for 6 months, dealing with the fact that he was dying of AIDS, and it was something that he regularly said that he was scared because he was dying of AIDS, and it was written down. As I say, all three are now dead. I took up the campaign baton really. In 2014, I decided to paint myself red and stand outside government buildings and protest, hoping that it would draw the press's attention, which it did. And with a collective campaign from many decades and recent, we managed to secure a public inquiry, which I think most of you are aware of. We're now awaiting the report for the government to respond to the recommendations, which actually Sir Brian has already given them. They've had it since April, the compensation recommendations. We're still waiting. So that's kind of my story, but also what touched me was your first speaker tonight. I couldn't see all of her name, the midwife, when she said that, you know, this is still going on today. I mean, these injustices, and actually I was dealt another lemon in 2021. My wife was diagnosed with a bladder stone. We waited until February, so it was June 21 she was diagnosed with a bladder stone. In February of 22, she finally received an appointment to go and have it removed. It wasn't a stone. Unfortunately, it was too late, and she passed away. She passed away in October of 2022. So just when she said it's still going on, it is still going on, because I haven't been able to get any answers as to why my wife was misdiagnosed, and medical notes that I have seen clearly state, and it was something that was pointed out to me, that they've written that the tumour was masquerading as a stone. I'm not actually sure what that means, but I'm still struggling now to obtain medical records. I've tried to report this to PALS and have been told that I need my wife's permission. She's dead. So I'm not getting anywhere. So this is why this Hillsborough law is so important. It's not just when I came to you tonight to say I am part of the contaminated blood scandal. Actually, this is deeper than that. Not just scandals, it is individual as well. So yeah, that's basically kind of where I'm at. And thank you all for inviting me to speak.
Oh, Tony, I'm really sorry to hear about your wife, and it's just it doesn't bear thinking of. Just on the social care aspect, when you were put into care, what was that like? Like when it came to, I'm like, you know, the family members were put into care as well. Why did you think that was the right thing to do? What was their attitude towards it? Why?
Well, actually, the care home for me was actually a highlight of my childhood. Really, they were very caring. It was an experience that I could have looked back on, and at the time when I gave evidence to the inquiry, I did look back on as a great time in my life. But unfortunately, I've received my care home note since I gave evidence to the inquiry, and what I uncovered in that was a level of stigma aimed at my father. Basically, the notes read that Mr. Fruger is coming to visit from hospital. Should he visit and drink and be offered a drink, the cup must be sterilised pronto. I also experienced being taken aside by the social workers, and I just couldn't remember. It was only reading the notes that it highlighted to me again, where I was taken into a larder, a big larder cupboard where they stored all the food, to be told never to talk about it. So although my experience was fantastic in social services, I never expected to be reading that level of disrespect towards my father 35 years later. So actually it's marred my experience of being in social services, but I can't fault the treatment that I received. While I was there, I didn't know what was going on behind my back.
Right. Well, thanks for speaking, Tony. I know it's your first time with us, and it's exhausting for everyone involved. I think I always feel really guilty, but I think unless we get these conversations out and we get people to understand what Hillsborough Law would stop in the future, like, it's well worth doing. And thank you very much for sharing your story with us. I'd like to go now to Matthew. This goes to now, what's happening now. So we've been talking about like you and Will and Steve, obviously a bit pre-Hillsborough, and Matthews, we can probably all recognise what happened in the last 3 years. So over to you, if you could come online now, Matt.
Thank you very much. If I could just start by thanking you all for inviting me along to this meeting. I feel very sort of privileged to be amongst you all, to be honest. I mean, activism isn't something that I saw myself doing at any point. This is kind of snuck up on me a bit. But through what I've done over the last few years, I've come into contact with some of your campaigns, and I've seen some of the work that some of you have done, and it's inspirational. And I can only hope that I'm going to be as good an influence and an inspiration to people that come after me in the same way that you've inspired me. And I think that one of the things to take into account in that is that clearly you guys have all been working for a range of times, but a long time. And I think that sort of shows that over the time that you guys have been working, you made a difference, but things haven't changed enough. And clearly the sort of implementation of something like this Hillsborough Law is something that could make a really big difference to a lot of people, certainly our group. Speaking of our group, so our mission has been to learn lessons and save as many lives as we can. I've said in however many interviews that I've done over the years that I can't do anything to bring my dad back, but if there's something that I can do to save lives in the future, then I feel entirely obligated to do it. Speaking of Dad, he was a big part of my life and somebody that I miss incredibly. He was an engineer, a family man, a man of, I always describe him as a man of boundless charisma, usually the life and soul of every party, including the ones he wasn't actually invited to. You could take him anywhere, he would make friends, he would become centre of attention. He was a big part of everybody's lives. So it was a difficult shock to lose him so young. I was only 33, he was 56. It's certainly not when I was expecting to lose him. The pandemic obviously has touched everybody. I don't think it's anything that we can blank out. I don't think anybody came through it unscathed in one way or another. It was a difficult thing to see happening. I can remember being at work at the start of 2020, seeing what was happening in China and what was happening in Italy and eventually Spain as the pandemic slowly made its way to our shores, and wondering why nothing was being done about it. And I could talk at great length about that sort of lack of preparedness. In fact, there's been a whole module about it in the inquiry that's happening at the minute. And fortunately, it seems that enough evidence is coming out that's showing it in the light that it needs to be. But it was a long road to get to that. Dad got ill in sort of mid-March. He wasn't the sort of guy to make a fuss. He tended to downplay feeling ill. He certainly didn't want to blow anything out of proportion. He didn't take it seriously until things started to get really bad. Eventually, after some encouragement from my mum, he called for an ambulance and was eventually admitted to hospital on March the 23rd, which I'm sure some of you remember was the day of the first lockdown. The hospital were incredible. They fought very hard for his life, but it wasn't meant to be. His condition deteriorated quite substantially over the first week, eventually had to be intubated, and not long after that, he started experiencing other issues, major organ failure being a big part of that. And the hospital contacted us and said that he was past the point where they could do anything for him, and they made the decision to withdraw his life support and let him pass peacefully. It was a very difficult time, particularly for my mum. It was hard for me. I have come to terms with it since. I think that if the decision to withdraw his life support meant that somebody else who had a better chance to survive was given the medical attention they needed and that saved a life, then it was the right thing to do. It was unlikely that Dad would have made any recovery, and certainly his quality of life would have been seriously hampered in the very, very slim chance that he survived. For me, all of this started sitting in the funeral home. I was fortunate in some ways. My uncle was actually the funeral director, and it couldn't have been easy for him to bury his little brother. But at least we had a very personal touch on the funeral, and certainly on the planning of it. But sitting in the funeral home with my uncle and my mum and my sister being socially distanced, watching my mum completely crumble and not be able to do anything about it. I couldn't comfort her. I couldn't be anywhere near her. That was difficult. That was crushing. And I remember sitting in that parlour and saying that somebody needed to do something about this. But what could I do? I was just one man in a one-horse town in the Midlands, and nobody had any reason to listen to me or anything that I had to say. I was powerless. And that made me feel very small. And I imagine that's something that a lot of people have felt on this call. I came across an article in The Independent talking about a chap called Stuart Goodman, who had also died around the same time, a few days earlier. And the article spoke about his daughter, Jo. I'm sure that you guys can remember the way that people were around COVID. There was a lot of skepticism. There was a lot of people sort of downplaying the seriousness of it, saying there was nothing more than a cold or the flu or whatever. And so you can imagine that the comment section on an article posted on Facebook was horrendous. And I felt compelled to try to rectify that, and I commented saying that I knew what Jo had been going through, that I empathised and sympathised with her, and I agreed somebody needed to do something about it. And as I was sitting there trying to decide how I was going to try and get in touch with Jo personally to talk about it, she found me. She'd seen my comment out of all of the list of vileness that she'd been subject to, and reached out and said that she'd seen it and agreed someone needed to do something, and it should be us. And so we did. And that was April the 30th, 2020. And it was a difficult time. We were sort of very subject to a lot of negativity from members of the public. And little did I know that that was going to be something that I would see a lot of over the course of the next few years. But we started gaining traction. We started attracting other people that had lost people to COVID at the same time, and they began joining us. And one of the things that came out of that was meeting Elkin. And the guys at BJC, Elkin and Pete Weatherby, of course, they restored a lot of my faith in humanity, because they proved to me that there were people out there that were doing the right thing for the right reasons. And they were the ones that said that we wanted to do something, and clearly we didn't know exactly what, but they were the ones that said a public inquiry could be the way to go. And we started calling for a public inquiry in the summer of 2020. Big undertaking, obviously. It definitely didn't happen straight away. There was a lot of fight to make that happen, and we talked about it quite a lot. We started to make a name for ourselves in the media for what we're doing. But the things that sort of came out, the things that we were talking about, were this attempts to obfuscate justice. We were told, well, we were lied to and about and gaslit. The government tried very hard to not have an inquiry. In fact, pretty much everything that we did, they pushed back against quite strenuously. It became very clear that the last thing they wanted was for anybody to go digging up any sort of facts or truth. And from what we've seen so far in the first two modules that we've had, they had good reason to try and hide it. They were clearly doing everything that they shouldn't have been, and rubbing it in the nose of people. We had tried desperately to get meetings with people, and we're always told that the Prime Minister was too busy to talk to us because he was, I don't know, driving a tractor or visiting a crab farm or doing anything apart from apparently dealing with the giant health crisis that was killing thousands of people. Eventually, we got to the point where we were looking at having to try to take the government to judicial review to get what we wanted, which I think is an interesting thing to talk about when it comes to this Hillsborough law, because essentially we were being priced out of justice. It was going to cost us an insane amount of money to try to get what we needed, which is money that we didn't have. And meanwhile, the government had all the money in the world, and they still do. As you've seen, I'm sure, in the news over the last year or so, they've withheld evidence, tried to say that some evidence wasn't relevant, which of course in their decision that should be down to the chair, and then took the inquiry to judicial review themselves to try to avoid any of that information getting out. And they can quite happily spend as much public money as they like on that, but we didn't have that option. We still don't. We work very hard to try to raise funds to manage what we can, but that's still a drop in the ocean compared to what they're capable of doing. And that brings us on to the other things that I think that Hillsborough law could really help with, and that's that all of that information that has been obfuscated, lost WhatsApps, and I don't know about you guys, but like I can find WhatsApp messages on my phone from 10 years ago. I've had many phones in that time. These are obvious lies, and I think that's something that might make people personally culpable for some sort of consequence should change that attitude. I think that the effects that Hillsborough law could have isn't just a matter of fixing specific problems, but it can actually contribute to a massive paradigm shift. And I think that's the thing that's most important. One of the things that I've been saying is that the next pandemic might not happen in my lifetime. In fact, I desperately hope that it doesn't, but the chances are that one will happen, whether it's in 5 years or 10 years or 100 years, maybe 500 years, who knows. And we need to be better prepared for it. But I think an aspect of that is that politicians need to be politicians should do the right things for the right reasons, and they don't. So they should do the right things for the wrong reasons. The wrong reasons being, if they don't, they'll get found out. And that's what the inquiry is setting out to do, to find people out. But having some legislation or a law that says, hey, if you get found out, you're going to be really for it, is going to make a massive difference. Real consequences cause that shift. So that's where I've been for the last few years, looking at everything that happened, everything that we all know happened, we saw it happening, and looking at how those things have been sort of argued against or denied or hidden. And we've had to just weather that. But we wouldn't have to.
Sorry, Matthew. Just on all the injustices that we're talking about, past as far as back as just the people in this room. To my knowledge, not one person's been held accountable.
No.
Between all of us. Not one.
No, exactly. I think there's been, to my understanding, with a lot of these things, there's this kind of idea that people can't be held personally responsible. They can, that accountability, that personal accountability, doesn't seem to be there at all. I mean, surely when it comes to a public inquiry, if there's if evidence is uncovered that says that somebody committed a crime, then it would be up to the Crown Prosecution Service to bring charges against them. But it doesn't seem to be something that's happened, and maybe that's the sort of thing that does need to be implemented and changed.
Thank you for speaking to us tonight, Matthew, and everyone else as well. No, thank you. Just really to take it out to the floor, because I'm hoping that we've educated people who didn't really understand what Hillsborough Law was. And if there's anyone out there who would like to tell their story about what's happened, does anyone would like to speak? Liz Howard?
Hi. I'm just, hi Debbie, sorry, I'm just coming in. I'm going to just put my headphones on because I think the speakers are not great on this computer, but I just wanted to say a really heartfelt thank you to everyone that shared their story and experience this evening. I hadn't realised the breadth and depth of, you know, how far the campaigning activity goes and how far reaching it is, but how much it's absolutely needed. And I suppose for me, I really want to know what I can do as a social worker to support your campaigning activity. What do I need to do, and what can I support our members at BASW in doing as well, and ensuring that we're supporting you as families that are experiencing and continuing to go through this level of trauma and seeking justice, but also in terms of connecting others as well with the campaigning activity.
So what we would love is anyone who you feel within your organisation who would like to share their story with others, because all these little, even though there's 20, well, there was 20 of us on this call, every time we have the call, it's one person who really understands it and they go out and speak, and especially because, like, I'm in a Liverpool bubble. You know, everyone here knows what Hillsborough Law is, but if I go outside the bubble, they all say, oh, it's about football, it's about safety in the pitch, about Liverpool Football Club. And this is me an Evertonian, so I'm not even a Liverpool supporter. But it's just about educating anyone else. So it's inviting them into our campaign. Follow us on Twitter. If they want to get involved in the campaign and do what these guys are doing, which is exhausting for them, and 100% commend all of you speaking tonight. And also we need funds. Basically, we are an organisation run by volunteers. We have 1 day a week member of staff, which is me, which is not 1 day a week. We're not a big organisation with communications and all that. We get a lot of support from Pete. Now Pete, Matthew was talking about Pete and Elkin. Elkin Abramson was the solicitor for 27 Hillsborough families. He also represented some of Grenfell and Manchester Arena bombing. Pete Weatherby is the King's Counsel, was King's Counsel for Hillsborough families. He works on the COVID-19 bereaved families, and he's Garden Court North and Garden Court. They're just an amazing organisation. I don't know how they make any money, because they literally just help as many people as they can. They are amazing. So we just need to have obviously more funds. So we'd like, at the moment, affiliated to our campaign are CWU Union, who are really great, give us all the help we can get. And that's it basically. At the moment we haven't got any support or funds coming in. So we just need whatever fundraising we can get, and what we say about that is if BASW would become an affiliate, they're all over our branding, and we have all the organisations all lined up together. Sorry, my son's come in the room. So yeah, but any help you can give, just spread the word, share us on Twitter, and help the others as well, because they're all individually campaigning for their own fight.
Debbie, if it's okay, if you don't mind me jumping in, I know folks may need to drop off in a minute. Would it be okay if I just quickly share a 3-minute video from our national director, who unfortunately couldn't be here tonight, but I think wants a message just for people here as well as our members to try and rally up support. So assuming the technology is kind to me, I will try and do that now. Can you see the video okay?
Yes, we can.
I will press play in that case.
I'm honoured to represent the association and to express our strong support for the Hillsborough Law Now campaign. I'm really sorry I can't be with you in person, and it's great that Josh is able to attend the event tonight. I would like to thank everyone who's taken the time and courage to share your experiences, and again, to reinforce, it takes courage to share your stories. As social workers, standing up for human rights and social justice is central to our profession. The Hillsborough Law Now campaign's core demands align closely with our professional identity, our values of integrity, transparency, and giving parity to the voice of citizens. Firstly, the campaign calls for a legal duty of candour, requiring authorities to proactively cooperate with investigations and inquiries. It is incumbent on us all to help end the culture of collusion, cover-up, lies and concealment, because it is the right thing to do, the right thing to do. Secondly, the campaign demands parity of legal representation for victims and families during inquests, providing public funding so the truth is not obscured by the imbalance of financial, legal and other resources. Our profession works alongside and with the people we serve to share voice, to promote human rights and social justice. Earlier today, BASW held a social work during disasters conference, reflecting on the role of social workers in disaster relief, both domestically and internationally. This conference is an incredibly important event, and it leaves a legacy of bringing together the bereaved, survivors and representatives who've been directly impacted in public disasters and faced injustice. As a profession, we must constantly re-examine our role, staying vigilant against institutional and systematic lies and bias. We must be courageous in exposing injustice. With the Hillsborough Law campaign reforms, we can create a society where transparency and honesty are normalised in public service. We urge all BASW England members and social workers to join this campaign and actively support Hillsborough Law Now. By raising our voices together, we can honour the victims of the many tragedies and injustices discussed today, and we can make real progress towards a more just society. The voices of those speaking to us today who have struggled for truth and accountability must not be in vain. Please join us today in demanding a Hillsborough Law Now. We will support you in any way we can. Thank you.
Thank you for giving us a moment to share that video, and just a brief thank you from myself as well, for those who've taken the time this evening to come and speak, and to members as well. I hope you kind of heed Debbie's message and get stuck in, make sure that your voice is heard in this. And of course, if you can spare some change, do donate as well. I've sort of been tasked with kind of rallying support within BASW for this over the last year or so, but it's no use just being a friendly face in a meeting. We have to take it to the next level now, and lobbying activity is expensive, and if we want to keep up with the big organisations that are well funded, we do have to dig deep, and it will take a lot of us to get this over the line. You certainly will have my support. And I hopefully that will grow and grow as more people see what the campaign is about and what you're doing, and how this really does align with social work values. So thank you so much. And Debbie, over to you if you want to wrap up as well. Thank you.
No, thanks for having us, and thank you for everyone who spoke tonight. If there's anyone who would like to get involved, please email us. It's info@hillsboroughnow.org. Our website is Hillsborough Law Now, all one word, and we are on Twitter, so please follow us. And if you want to get in touch and just get involved, be my guest. You'll be very welcome. Thanks very much for having us, Josh.
Thank you so much, and have a good evening, everyone, and hopefully see some of you again soon. Good night.
Good night.
Thank you all so much. Thank you.